Hello, everybody. Welcome to When I'm High. This is the podcast that is all about what it's like to be high on marijuana. Today, we have a very special guest. In a few episodes ago, you heard Abdullah. He is one of the co-hosts of the podcast Great Moments in Weed History, and I am lucky enough to have the other co-host on today, David Bienenstock. Please tell the people who you are, what you do, what do they need to know, what are your plugs?
Well, plugs has two meanings.
More than two, maybe.
Yeah, right now my plug is my backyard because I'm growing my 6 plants here in California
Nice.
where it is legal. And off the top, I'll say, weed is on the ballot in 7 different states. If you don't know, you should look it up. It might be where you live. So
Mm-hmm.
you can also have some legal weed. I am a journalist and an author and a podcaster. So I started writing about cannabis more than 15 years ago. I was working at High Times back when it was independent and cool and renegade. If you want to know what happened, actually, a great Politico article just came out. So Google Politico High Times. And then along the way, I've written a column about cannabis and food for Vice and made a show for them called Bong Appetit, which is actually not where I met Abdullah, my co-host on Great Moments in Weed History. It's not where we met, but that's really where we developed a creative partnership and a really great friendship and started having all kinds of weed discussions. And at a certain point, he parted ways with Vice, and I parted ways with High Times around the same time. Uh, and we really wanted to produce, after working for all these, big brands, at least big brands in cannabis for sure. We wanted to produce something independently, something that came really from the heart, something that is entertaining. We both like to entertain people, but that adds something to the culture. And so, Great Moments in Weed History. Every episode is about a different story. Could be anything from Willie Nelson smoked a joint on the roof of the White House.
Yes.
To yeah, he sure did. A fat Austin torpedo, or Napoleon invaded Egypt, and that's how hashish got to Europe. Or we have an episode, how did the cannabis coffee shops in Amsterdam first open? A wild story. Or Maya Angelou has an incredible cannabis story, Fela Kuti. So, we're 3 seasons into it now, and it's a lot of fun. And my other thing is I write a lot for Leafly and always like to shout
Mm.
them out. They treat me very well as a journalist, and it's a great outlet for my writing.
That's awesome. You can't see, but I'm smiling over here because, when you're talking about your podcast, because it's just so amazing to hear these stories that span, millennia, and cannabis has been such an important part of this history that we just have no idea about. And so it's a very informative and funny podcast, and hearing you guys talk about this has been great. I think I'm all caught up on all 3 seasons. And actually, after Abdullah's episode aired, I started talking a little bit with Rye Pritchard, who was I guess the cannabis expert on Bong Appetit, and I ended up binging the first 2 seasons in probably a week or something like that, and that is such an amazing show. What was your role on that?
Well, it began as a web series. So I worked on the web series, which is about 12 episodes, maybe 16, 12 or 15 episodes. I always forget. So that was a precursor to the show. Then moved on to Viceland, the cable show. But I worked on the web series, and that was really fantastic. Like I said, that's where Abdullah and I really got to know each other. And all those episodes are still online. I think the most famous one that we did was there's a woman called Nona Marijuana who is
Mm.
90. She was 93 when we made the video. and she is an incredible activist for cannabis and one of the funniest people, and actually somebody very close to my heart. I know her and her family well, and they are an incredibly beautiful cannabis farm and great people who really love the plant and have done a lot for the community. If you know Wham,
Mm,
or we have actually an episode of the podcast called Wham Takes Down the DEA,
mm-hmm.
about this collective of patients who grew cannabis for each other and took care of each other. And the DEA came in and raided their garden, and they hung tough and sued the government and kept doing what they were doing and really changed the culture.
Yeah, I remember that being one of the more emotional episodes. That was really touching and heartbreaking, and a triumph, really.
Yeah, and I'm happy to say, it's been a bit of a bumpy road the last few years, but Wham is coming back really, really strong, and you're going to hear a lot about Wham in a few months, and it's going to be really, really good news.
Awesome.
So that's some of the things that makes me the happiest right now is seeing that happen. So
That's good to hear. Well, should we get to the actual interview portion of this?
I'm ready, my friend.
All right. So, this is a very standard first question when it comes to cannabis, but could you tell me the first time that you tried pot, and if it wasn't the first time that got you high, what was the first time that you actually did get high?
Yeah, I talk about this a little. I wrote a book called How to Smoke Pot Properly, and I do tell this story. It was this is a very New Jersey uh, version of this. It was behind a bowling alley.
Nice.
I bet I've had this conversation with a lot of people over the years, and people, oh, we went up to this lake and all the stars. I'm like, yeah, we were behind the bowling alley on Route 22. And you know, I'll talk about the first time I got high, and it was a very profound experience. I'm somebody who had a lot of anger and anxiety as a younger person, and it was the beginning of the process of dealing with some of that, dealing with it in a really healthy way, and
Mm,
and in a way that I know changed the course of my life, just sort of internally.
yeah.
And then obviously, even before I had a career in cannabis, as wonderful and gross as that sounds to say it that way, but before that, I was on a cannabis path, and I met people through cannabis, and it informed, simply one of the things that, like, I love about cannabis so much and miss right now. Even in a hip place, like I lived in New York City for a long time, where cannabis is illegal still to this day, but lots of people smoke weed. You'd still have to go around to the back room of the party or out back of the concert, or it now the marginalization and the threat of arrest is terrible, and I was arrested, and so many people are, and the whole system's so fucking racist. But the marginalization and the need to share the act together and pass a J around, it brings you in contact with a specific subset of society, and I would say a really cool one, and
Yeah.
one that is way preferable to a random sampling of people. I don't know if you've been out and about in the world, Spencer, uh, but a lot of people are dicks, and I like to say, cannabis isn't the cure for being an asshole, but it's a good place to start. I think I'm still working on it,
Sure. Me
but
too.
I think when you think of cannabis people, even if they're an asshole, they would be worse. You know what I
Oh,
mean? It's
yeah.
it's everybody with their edges a little rounded off and a little more open to disagreeing without being disagreeable. And I forget the question, not to be honest with you, but I'm sure I answered it at some point. And
Yes,
the larger point is, oh, from getting high for the first time. It really helped me internally as a person, but I also think it's affected in so many ways the people I've met, the places I've gone, the experiences I've had, and I would say much for the better.
absolutely. And you're definitely not the first person to say, some people might be less assholey if they got high. And, that's something that I've thought about for a long time, that, it could be, it could be what almost saves the planet if people, would just, I could go off on that, but I won't. But yes, you did answer the question, and I actually appreciate that you kept it relatively short in, uh, in the hopes that maybe to sell some more books. If people want to hear the entire story, they should go buy your book. So people go buy his book. Oh, and your Instagram and Twitter handle, is it pot underscore properly or something like
That
that?
is Instagram, and Twitter is pot underscore handbook.
Handbook. Okay, yes, that's right. So that's where I'll put that in the episode notes as well. But that's where you all can find him in the social medias. So do you have a preferred method of intake?
I I mean, if something's really good, I mean, it's like to be nostalgic for smoking a joint with your friends. It's kind of sad, to think about, but I really am. And like, I would say to me, if cannabis is really good and the people you're hanging out with is a really good crew, uh, and there's not a global pandemic,
Yep.
uh, sharing a joint with your friends is about as good as it gets.
Sure. Very
Um,
communal.
very communal. I'm not a dab person. You'll never dab with. Well, I don't mean you specific. If I'm dabbing, I'm in my pajamas, and it's like twice a year.
Mm-hmm.
Just a personal preference. But to me, yeah, sharing a joint with your friends, like I could go for that right now.
Nice, nice. And during a pandemic, are you just smoking by yourself? Is it edibles?
My wife and I are in the weed germ bubble together, but yeah, and then for a productive day, I have I don't know if a gentleman, Bob Snodgrass is an incredible glass blower and a huge part of that history, kind of the OG of all of it, and I have a pipe that he blew that I like to just keep on my desk while I'm working, and take a puff now and then and keep it at a nice level for working, and then 3 or 4 puffs before being on a podcast about being high seems about right, and probably maintain that along the way.
Sure, very appropriate. And that was Bob Snobgrass. Did I hear that correctly?
Snodgrass.
Snot. That makes more
And
sense.
actually, yeah,
Yes.
it's all free, people. And I don't know. I don't want anybody to have to buy anything. But there's a Leafly article that I wrote about him, Bob Snodgrass, the Godfather of Glass. It's
Mm,
actually a show I'm sure that we're going to do on great moments in weed history coming up. Definitely that key of a figure in that whole scene, and an incredible person, and just a stone cold hippie, and blows beautiful pieces of art that you can smoke weed out of, and that he very much wants you to smoke weed out of. And his story was, long amazing story short, he used to go from dead show to dead show. He'd set up pipes to sell, and his glass blowing equipment, and he'd make pipes right in front of people, so that would draw
wow.
a crowd. Then he had, it was him and his whole family, like his wife and his kids. So, and every year he'd come back to town with the dead, and people would bring their friends, and really he created an entire art craft industry that continues to this day, remains really craft. It doesn't have to be some really expensive. If you want to get yourself a nice glass piece, you can look at the Instagrams of the shit that like costs $50,000 and appreciate it as art. And there's even art shows where you can go and look at them. And there's a whole culture around that. I'm not. That's not. I appreciate it, but it's not like I'm deeply a part of that culture. But to have a nice glass piece of your own that costs a couple $100 and was made by a skilled artisan.
Mm-hmm.
if it's and support the arts, and if one can afford it or makes a lovely gift, just seek out a glass blower that you like, and contact them directly, or go to a really good reputable shop.
Yeah, I'm really impressed with what glass blowers create. It's very much art, and like you said, it's also this very practical thing that you can smoke out of, which is pretty amazing. Yeah, I mean, I've seen pictures of some of these creations that people have made, and it just blows my mind. So yeah, obviously, and I can't wait to hear that the rest of that story about Bob. Look forward to that.
Yeah, right on. I think it will be in our next season. I'll say that much.
Nice. Season 4, 20. All right. So, in a very general sense, what does it feel like to be high for you specifically?
Yeah, well, that can really vary, which is nice. You know, I think you can set some intentions even. If you want to get into a creative zone, if you want to get tamp down some anxiety or get hungry. I think a lot of it is dose dependent, which is also nice because you can, one puff of cannabis, you feel it. Even obviously have been smoking quite a lot for quite a long time, but if you don't, the thing about it is, like, if you overconsume, it's not a value judgment. It's like, I don't think you're a good or a bad person because you smoke more or less pot. I just think that you can actually get more out of it by kind of being intentional with your use most of the time. And then sometimes you just want to fucking chief down. You know what
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying? But like in terms of one puff might just loosen you up to play some basketball. But to me, smoking half a joint, I don't want somebody in my face screaming and slapping at the ball, and you know what I mean? That's
Yeah,
it's not too high for life. It's just too high to play basketball or to do
sure.
your taxes. But if I'm, gonna watch a movie, that's a totally different zone that I want to get into. Or like when we're recording the podcast, I want to be toned in and feeling good and kind of vibing with Abdullah and connecting. But I also, it's a complicated little dance to do the show. So that's a vibe to set. I think that's what's so great about it is it has these different, there's the medicinal effects, which that's a whole other thing, for so many different ailments. And then there's what a guy, Dr. Lester Grinspoon, used to call enhancement, which is making food taste better, making music sound better, making everything that you already enjoy better. That's a pretty awesome thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's to get the most out of it, and like that's what you want, is to really develop that relationship with the plant, and be conscious and intentional in your use of it.
Yeah, I like that because, like you said, there are different experiences in life and different, doses that make sense for each of those things. I don't think it's any surprise to people that playing basketball and watching a movie are vastly different experiences, and so yeah, they are definitely going to require different doses, and it depends on the person, obviously. You mentioned the medicinal purposes. Do you use cannabis for any specific medicinal purposes? Does it help you medically?
Yeah, I would say, for anxiety, if you want to get right down to like what would be a diagnosis that, for example, you might be prescribed prescription drugs for, or that is
Hmm.
in, because you can define medicinal use a lot of ways,
Yeah.
like soul medicine for sure. I wouldn't have that conversation with an MD studying it as a cancer treatment necessarily, but I believe in that as a medicinal use. that just like the human condition, you know, is enough for
Yeah.
everyone to need a little medicine. For me personally, I would say anxiety, but in my work as a journalist and also in volunteering with that group WHAM that I was talking about, that really focuses on people with severe ailments. And I've seen so many people whose lives have been transformed by cannabis as a medicine, from pediatric uh, cases, children with these, severe seizure disorders, all the way to end of life, you
Hmm.
know? And so that to me, ultimately, like how we got here. Spencer, do you mind if I ask how old you are?
I'm 40, just turned 40.
Okay, so we're pretty contemporary
Yeah.
age-wise, but I'm sure younger people are listening to this and are going to come of age, depending on where you live, in a world where cannabis is legal and also pretty well thought of by a lot of people. But you and I are old enough to have come up in a world where, for most people, there was no most people in the United States and around the world, that there was no medicinal access to this plant, and the amount of people who suffered. Sometimes I just think of all the people who suffered through chemotherapy and didn't at least have the option to try cannabis, or the knowledge, the education about it to try it. That's horrible. And what ultimately flipped it on its head is, in California, through the work of a lot of activists, a lot of people who were in the gay community when it was hit with the AIDS crisis. We actually did 2 episodes about this on Great Moments in Weed History, one about Dennis Perone, one about Brownie Mary. If you love cannabis and those names are not known to you, please understand what people sacrificed to
Hmm.
create medical cannabis and were arrested and shot. Dennis Perone was shot by the police, but they created medical cannabis first in San Francisco and then in California. And what it allowed, beyond the access, it gave people the ability to talk openly about their experiences with cannabis as a medicine. And every person who did that were able to convince a lot of people in their lives that what they were saying is true. Like, you have to be such an unbelievable asshole that if your aunt comes to you and says, "Oh my God, I'm no longer puking my way through chemotherapy because I smoke a little weed," and you want to call the cops on your beloved aunt or your kid or your fucking grandma, that person just almost does not exist,
Hmm.
you know? And so what happened is, that is really the way that some deep understandings about the plant spread, and the momentum that led up to legalization and this huge, huge change in public opinion. That is where it came from, and I've spoken with so many people. Cannabis, it's life transforming as a medicine, and it does not have these terrible side effects of pharmaceuticals. And so, it's a profound experience of healing, that I've seen firsthand so much. And I'll just say this to people listening: there's going to come, you obviously are 20 something minutes into hearing me high talking about weed. You're on team weed. Part of team weed is, there's going to be somebody in your life who gets a cancer diagnosis, or many other ailments, from MS to, you can look it up. You have to be the person to at least educate them, and at least make them aware of all the science that shows how helpful it can be for them. And if you're in a prohibition state, you have to bring them cannabis and show it to them and ask them if they want to try it. And at that point it's their decision. But I think that's, you don't want to look back and wish that you did that.
Yeah, I absolutely think that it is up to, specifically in the cannabis world, it is up to the people who are fans of this plant to do the work to get the word out there as much as possible, because there are still people who just don't understand. And like you said, you're going to know somebody who gets cancer or something, and it is on all of us to help out in any way we can. I know some people who keep it very private and they're not activists and they don't really want to talk about it, and that's okay, but I also feel like, this is a thing that helps people both physically and emotionally and spiritually. So let's get, thankfully the ball is already rolling, but it needs a lot of help. It needs as many people behind it as we can get. The episode that will air before yours hasn't aired yet at the time of this recording, is my wife's best friend of over 30 years. She was already a cannabis user, but she got diagnosed with breast cancer, and it, luckily she was able to take it legally at that point. But it helped her immensely going through chemo, and I mean, it's just heartbreaking. But yeah, on that note, how does your level of focus change when you're high? Terrible segue into that one, but I love this question because it's so prevalent with cannabis. How does your focus change? Does it get wider? Does it get more focused? How is that with you?
Yeah, I think, partially it has to do with some of what we talked about with dosage and intention. And then, it's such a trendy thing. Like, people talk about flow state and, that whole kind of mind hacking, I find it distasteful, the modern iteration of it. But the idea within it, is intrinsic to cannabis for me. And I think the best example I can give, and maybe an example of why weed history is important to me and why I think people need to know it, at least if they care about weed. Some of the earliest adopters of cannabis culture in the United States. Now, cannabis culture goes back 10,000 years to the beginning of agriculture, with cannabis being one of the first, if not first, plants that were grown, that were farmed, rather than collected or foraged. So there's always been cannabis culture as long as there's been cannabis in all different forms, many of which we don't know about, but like ancient culture, Scythians and shit. But in the United States, jazz musicians, from the beginning of jazz, it's so intertwined with cannabis, and that comes to bear in a lot of ways, but among them are this idea about improvisation
Mm.
and being, in this flow state that is both high amount of concentration but also completely let go. The paradox within that is something that cannabis can really help you achieve. Whereas, I think obviously a lot of people like to drink, and I do not turn down a drink at the end of the night myself, but it doesn't engender that state, and ultimately if you drink enough it's going to slow your reflexes down. So as a jazz musician, but what they found in cannabis was the ability to reach this state where you're very, very closely concentrating on what you're doing, but you're also lost in it, and able to react in the moment. And that's the best state I like to get into with cannabis if I can.
Yeah, I think that's the fascinating. You put it so well. It's this paradox of being hyper focused and concentrated, but also having this wide range of focus at the same time, or being lost in it, whatever that is. It's this fascinating thing that these two things can happen at the same time when somebody is high. And it's amazing that it can work. I mean, yeah, if you go a little too far, it might, it might not work so well. But if you hit that right spot, which I think is a pretty big white right spot. It's pretty amazing what can happen. And yeah, the the improvisation, the jazz musicians. I mean, I know my dad brings that up all the time. That's one of his favorite examples, and a lot of people bring it up a lot because it is such this perfect example of during this time before it was made illegal that they could just do whatever they wanted, and they were experimenting and creating this new art form, and it's just mind blowing. I played in a jazz band in school a little bit, but I never got into the improv aspect of it really. And um, I so I'm not a jazz scholar, but I really want to go back and listen to old recordings of that and just get lost in sort of what they were doing and get into that mindset. It's beautiful.
Yeah, and we have an episode of Great Moments in Weed History. It's all about Louis Armstrong and
Yes.
his weed dealer slash occasional accompanist, Mez Mesro. And this guy wrote. I'll just say enough. If this perks your ears up or not, that's up to you. But uh, I based a lot of the history in the episode on this guy Mesro was sort of the weed dealer of the day in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance and during this incredible period in jazz history in the 20s and 30s. And he wrote a memoir about it, about his experiences playing jazz, selling weed to all these jazz musicians. And so, yeah, it's actually, I think that might be my personal favorite episode and just an era of history. If I had a weed time machine uh, and I could go back to any weed scene of all time, that is definitely where I would personally head.
Yeah, I think I would join you because that would be an amazing place to go to. Did you ever hear there was I think it was like a Comedy Central made for TV movie with what's her name, Alana Glazer, and her and her cousin have a bong that's a time
Oh,
machine.
yeah, yeah,
Did
yeah.
Yeah. It was super goofy, but obviously very funny because of the premise, and she is amazing. But yeah, I enjoyed that very goofy movie. It wasn't about going to weed times in history, but it was definitely a weed time machine.
I mean, I think that's a pretty common dream.
Oh yeah, yeah. I wish this bong could just take me through time. Well, speaking of time, what is your sense of time like when you get high?
That's hard to distinguish because I probably don't have the best sense of time
When you're
when I'm
sober?
not high. Yeah, I guess I like to daydream. So daydreaming is probably more to do with my loss of sense of time than weed. Although there's probably there's definitely correlation between weed and daydreaming, and I'm guessing causation as well.
Sure, sure. So, yeah, just more lost in time and daydreaming when you get high.
Yeah.
You mentioned creativity before. How, for you personally, how do you think your creativity is affected? You're obviously a writer, probably other things as well. Do you feel more or less creative when you get high?
I'm gonna shock you to say more. I mean,
Shocking.
those are kind of the two pillars of my professional life are making things in weed.
Yeah,
And of course, that comes from what I was always interested in and trying to turn it into a job. And I think, what people really need to know is that there's something called hyperpriming, which is a scientific term for basically how your brain makes connections between two ideas or thoughts or observations or words or anything that don't necessarily have an obvious connection. And what this study showed, you can find it, just Google cannabis hyperpriming for the study or for some longer explanations. But basically found that when you're high, the brain makes more of these connections. And I think that's the key to creativity. In the example of a jazz musician who's improvising and doing it in real time, that's where the hyper comes in. You're able to make these connections at a faster rate, and when you're dealing in the split second timing of playing in a jazz trio or quartet, and everyone's improvising, that's the key. And of course, you can train yourself towards that, whether you use cannabis or not. And you can smoke cannabis every day and not know how to play the trumpet at all. But there is scientific evidence for that. For me, like I said, basketball is my game. Basketball is also improvisational like that. A
Mm.
couple puffs, I'm in there. I don't doubt that other people can smoke 5 dabs and play basketball and run game on me all day. But for me, that's my experience. And when I'm writing, I can definitely get pretty high because there's no one watching me. It's not a performance and it's not a competitive sport. So if I blank out for a few minutes and then come back, and I don't mean blank, you know what I'm saying? Like if
Yeah.
I daydream off the given path of what I'm actually trying to create for a couple of minutes and then come back to it, no harm, no foul. So I think, cannabis is most definitely a creative tool for me. It is also proven by science, but it is not a replacement for creativity or an excuse to not create. So if you find yourself, I speak a bit more to younger people, and from my own experience, like if you find yourself smoking a bunch of weed and 2 hours later, if you haven't actually created something, then it didn't make you creative. You might have had some interesting thoughts, and that is a kind of creativity. But if one is to be a creator, you got to make shit, and it doesn't have to necessarily be uh, great. But that's how to use it as a creative tool. I think in the book I said, decide what you're going to do after you get stoned, before you get stoned, and then do it.
Yeah, and I do feel like, like you said, if you got high for 2 hours and you didn't actually create something, but you had some thoughts, those thoughts, if they are that could be a form of creativity if you were thinking of things that you will then create later, maybe when you are or not, are not high. I think we've all had the experience of thinking back on that later and be like, oh, well, that really wasn't a very good idea. But sometimes I think there are some gems in there, and it depends on what your form of creation is. If it's writing, or something, you could come back to that later, stoned or not, and create the thing that you had the idea for when you got high. But yeah, especially for musicians and artists, I mean that is in the moment, get high, do the thing. Who knows what's gonna come out of that?
And then I got to say, on the back end too, a lot of writing or like editing. I've had other jobs where I edited video.
Mm-hmm.
If I write a long piece, a long, investigative journalism story, I will have read some version of that dozens and dozens of times before it's done. And cannabis does two things for me also that I should definitely mention. One is gives me the ability to sit and go through things that I've already gone through a lot and not lose my fucking mind and get super fucking bored. But the kind of the opposite, to kind of lock into it. And so that is incredibly valuable to me, because I think that's the difference between your good work and your best work is the amount of time you can put into it. And the other thing is, and I think as a musician, I'd like to hear your thoughts, but with editing video or with reading these things, you need fresh eyes on something that you've listened to 50 times, or you're editing a piece of video and you've watched it 50 times, how are you going to have the perspective of somebody, who hasn't seen it once? And you can't, but cannabis really fucking helps with that. And you just take a little break, you smoke a little bit, you come back, and you just kind of mentally reset.
Yeah, I will say my day job is actually a lot of video editing, and not for work, but on some personal projects, I have actually gotten high and gone to work on these projects. It's only happened really a couple of times, but it's definitely exactly what you're saying. You see it with fresh eyes. It's not it's not the beast that it was before. It's this sort of new thing, and it just allows you to just to see it differently, and like you said, make connections of things that maybe you hadn't before. I think I've even edited some of the earlier episodes of this podcast hype, and it felt right. It felt like I was finding things that I just hadn't seen before. I don't know. I can't speak to making music specifically, because I haven't been a musician for a long time. That's something that I want to get back into, actually. But yeah, from like a video or audio editing standpoint, everything you said makes sense.
And this will apply, to, anything that is broadly creative in your life. You can just enhance the experience of it, cooking a meal or woodworking, or you know
Or just
whatever
experiences.
whatever you're into. That was the idea of Dr. Grinspoon, and we have a episode of him about him and his friendship with Carl Sagan,
Mhm.
as best buds, so to speak. And that insight that it enhances things. This is somebody who is a Harvard Medical School professor and an MD and a brilliant researcher, who got into cannabis by trying to convince Carl Sagan not to smoke it, and ended up realizing that the case against weed was all propaganda, and actually enjoyed smoking cannabis the rest of his life, often with Carl Sagan, and came to realize. And so, when you have a medical doctor, and a Harvard Medical School professor telling people, "Hey, this stuff just enhances your life," and that's good. Like even in the medical, in the early days of like just trying to convince people that it was a medicine, often, there was an instinct, for good reasons, not to talk about the pleasure of it. And that's what's cool about this show, and not to talk about the enhancement of it. And that's so important, and also medicinal, also part of healing yourself, even like I said, even just from the human condition. And so, like, what's cool about this show, and why I'm very appreciative that you invited me onto it, is, there's a lot of media around cannabis right now. There's a lot of even just podcasts around cannabis right now. I think they're all, well, maybe not all of them. I haven't listened to all of them. There's probably a Nazi weed
Oh
podcast.
yeah.
But, uh, whether there's a lot covering the news of it, which is great, the business side of it, which, at least I think, if you're putting, a good perspective on it, is important. We try to do the history, but just simply the experience of being high and the pleasure of it, or the medicinal aspects, or it's important to have that discussion, because it's an important part of what the plant brings into our lives.
Well, thank you for saying that. And I'm the one who's appreciative that you agreed to be on this podcast. And this is what you said is exactly why I wanted to create this in the first place. It was something that I was curious about, that I wanted to talk to people about, because people don't talk about this. They talk about the medical side, the business side, the news of it, which is all very, very important. But I just felt like I can't really speak to those things. I can talk to people about those things, but the thing that interested me the most was, what is it like? And so yeah, thank you for doing this. I do have one more question for you. I know that we're almost at our time. I of course could talk to you for hours about this, and if we had the world in that would allow this, I would love to just sit with you and at a bar or restaurant or whatever and just talk about these things. But that's not the reality. So
Well,
my question
hold
is,
on. I
go
got an
ahead.
idea. We work out this time traveling bong thing.
Ah,
We go back to the 1920s jazz scene. No pandemic, plenty of reefer, probably at a very, very good price,
oh yeah.
and we'll do it there.
I think that's a great plan, and that it's just after the 1918 pandemic. So
Yes, good sweet spot. Let's do pre-depression.
yeah,
Uh
so 20 to
okay,
28, 1920 to 19,
perfect.
100 years ago. It's a perfect time. I will get on that technology right after this. So my last question is, what do you want to say to Pot?
Thank you.
And thank you. I'm speaking as Pot. No, that's. I think that's what everybody would like to say to Pot. And I appreciate it. I appreciate you. And lastly, just where can people find you? Let's get those social media things out there again. And what's your book?
Oh, the book is called How to Smoke Pot Properly: A Highbrow Guide to Getting High. Like I said, and I don't ever want to tell people to buy anything. I'm sure you can find a used copy. I just hate buying things, so it's very hard for me to tell. Don't steal things. Like, okay, if it's from some big corporation, I honestly don't care. But support people who make things. You don't have,
Yes,
you know what I
yes,
mean? Definitely do some of that. And if you're stealing all your media, people make it, and you're stealing something. Just be comfortable with it at least. Don't let yourself completely off the hook. Let me put it that way. Uh, and the podcast, which you can listen to completely for free, is called Great Moments in Weed History. And otherwise, like I said, I like to mention Leafly, where I often write about all aspects of cannabis.
nice. Um, what was I going to say? Can people buy the book directly from you, or do they have to go somewhere else to buy it?
I got some copies here. Yeah, I mean, it's not like an official thing, but I have a website that's myname.com. You can find my email there, and if you do that, I'll be happy to sell you a
Nice, nice. Go directly to the source,
book.
and if you guys want to give David and Abdullah a few bucks, they have a Patreon for their podcast. I highly, highly recommend that people do that. And this has been awesome. Thank you so much for doing this interview. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was a blast. I enjoyed it very much. Thanks for having me.
So, of course, I have to tell all the people the normal things. You can find my information in the episode notes. I have a Patreon if you want to donate, whatever. People know these things. Please rate and review, subscribe, all that good stuff. And until next time, this is Spencer and David talking about what it's like to be high. And next time, there will be a new interview. Thank you and goodbye.